Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're exploring a deeply provocative and, quite frankly, thoroughly researched premise presented in a recent book by Odon Lafontaine and the Nur al-Atham Collective. Now, this book asks a question that genuinely challenges the foundation of one of the world's largest religions. What if the Islamic holy city of Mecca, as it's described in ancient traditions, is actually a historical impossibility? We're going to impartially examine the geographical, archaeological, and textual evidence the authors used to build their case.
But to really grasp the weight of this investigation, we first need to anchor it in the emotional, lived experience of billions of people. Throughout this explainer, we'll be hearing from Bruno Guillot. He's a former prominent Salafist preacher who studied in Medina and actually completed dozens of pilgrimages. You see, for Bruno, and for nearly 2 billion Muslims worldwide, Mecca isn't just a dot on a map. It's the absolute center of gravity for their spiritual lives. It's an axis of faith.
Section 1. The Heart of Islam, a Holy City.
Just look at the modern reality of Mecca today. It is absolutely massive. The Hajj pilgrimage is a central pillar of Islam, drawing literally millions of the faithful from across the globe every single year. Plus, Muslims everywhere face this exact spot multiple times a day in prayer. Its significance simply cannot be overstated.
So here's the traditional narrative. Orthodox historical claims state that Mecca has been central to humanity since the very beginning. According to Islamic tradition, Adam built the first temple here, which was later restored by Abraham and his son Ishmael. By the 7th century, during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, the narrative describes Mecca as a bustling, prosperous metropolis, a massive commercial crossroads, and the undisputed birthplace of the Islamic faith.
Okay, let's dive into this. The authors of our source material pose a completely paradigm-shifting question. What if the physical environment and the historical record simply do not support the existence of a thriving ancient metropolis in this specific location? Let's take a closer look at the physical evidence.
Section 2. The Geographical Mirage, an Impossible City.
When you contrast the bustling modern metropolis with the actual natural terrain of the Mecca region, it's pretty startling. It is a harsh, dry, rocky desert ravine. The authors point out that this area experiences a subtropical desert climate with an average of only about 130 millimeters of highly irregular annual rainfall. Sometimes years go by with practically a full-blown drought.
Think about other successful desert cities, right? Places like Aswan, Khartoum, or even Las Vegas. They only thrive because they rely on continuous water sources, like massive rivers or colossal dams. Ancient Mecca, however, had absolutely no rivers, zero capability for agriculture, and relied on just a few pretty unreliable wells. The authors argue it lacked the basic water resources to sustain even a small town, let alone large flocks of livestock or massive trade caravans.
And this right here brilliantly illustrates the point. Even today, with all of our cutting-edge engineering, Mecca relies heavily on massive coastal desalination plants like the Shuaibah plant on the Red Sea, and a colossal pipeline system just to survive and support its pilgrims. The ancient world obviously didn't have this kind of technology.
Bringing Bruno Guillot back into the picture, he expresses the sheer shock of confronting this geographical reality. As a researcher and historian, he realized that the physical environment simply couldn't support the grand historical claims he'd spent his whole life teaching. That gap between dogma and reality was, as he calls it, an indescribable stupefaction.
Moving to Section 3, Contradictions in the Quran, Text versus Reality.
Now, what's really fascinating here is the literal text of the Quran itself. It actually describes the local audience of its revelations as agricultural farmers who cultivate wheat, olives, grapes, and pomegranates. It even describes them as fishermen. The authors argued this is geographically impossible in the barren inland subtropical desert of Mecca. There's no sea there and definitely no arable land.
The book points out some other pretty glaring discrepancies too. Traditional Mecca was supposedly a massive trade hub, right? Yet geographically, it was actually isolated, located about 100 kilometers off the main ancient incense route. Furthermore, the Quran speaks to an audience intimately familiar with the ruins of Sodom and Gomorrah near the Dead Sea. To put that into perspective, that is over 1,200 kilometers north of Mecca. Finally, the Quran addresses an audience that clearly knows all about Judaism and Christianity. Yet historians note there are virtually no traces of these communities in ancient Mecca.
So this sets up the ultimate mystery. If the geography, the water supply, and the literal text of the Quran itself rule out Mecca as the backdrop for these early events, well, where in the world is the true holy city the text is actually describing?
Let's explore that in Section 4, The Jerusalem Trail, Finding the Holy City.
The authors present some pretty striking linguistic connections. Take the Arabic word used for the temple, bait. It directly mirrors the Hebrew and Aramaic word bait, which means temple. Similarly, the Islamic pilgrimage, the Hajj, shares its exact linguistic root with Hajj, which designated the ancient pilgrimage to the temple in Jerusalem.
And it goes way beyond just language. The authors detail how the religious practices and topographical landmarks described in the Quran perfectly align with the ancient rituals and geography of Jerusalem. We're talking about the direction of prayer, the ritual sacrifices, even the mention of the Valley of Baca, which historically is the entrance to Jerusalem. Even the Quranic practice of walking between Marwa and Safa aligns beautifully with Mount Moriah and Mount Scopus in Jerusalem. The texts, they argue, are describing a completely different city.
Section 5. The Caliph's Invention, Rewriting History.
So how did we get here? The authors propose a really fascinating chronological shift. They suggest that the initial Islamic movement was actually centered entirely on Jerusalem and expectations of the end times. But when that initial project failed or shifted, successive caliphs over the following generations needed a way to solidify their own political and religious authority. To do this, the authors argue, they essentially invented Mecca, retrofitting history and moving the geographic focus deep into Arabia. This allowed them to legitimize their imperial rule in the name of God, but entirely separate from the older Jewish and Christian centers.
Wrapping up Bruno Guillot's personal journey, he describes feeling this profound sense of liberation after looking into this. Reviewing the historical and archaeological evidence helped him understand the mechanisms of what he calls a historical mystification. The mirage of Mecca had blinded him to the physical realities staring him right in the face during all those pilgrimages.
As independent researchers continue to dig up physical evidence that challenges our deepest traditional narratives, how will billions of believers reconcile dogma with archaeology? The authors of this book have laid out a really comprehensive geographical and textual argument, and it's a discussion that is absolutely going to shape how we understand history in the decades to come. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the history around you.